Please welcome to the stage Francis Townsend, Senior National Security Analyst, CBS News, and former Homeland Security Advisor to the President of the United States, Leadership Council member Concordia, and our distinguished panel.
Thank you very much. We have a very distinguished group to discuss cybersecurity today. You'll recognize most, if not all, the Honorable Tom Ridge, co-founder and executive chairman of Ridge Lane Limited Partners and the first Secretary of Homeland Security. General Keith Alexander, former director of the National Security Agency and former commander of Cyber Command. Dr. Reginald Brothers, Undersecretary of Science and Technology currently at the Department of Homeland Security, and Dr. Greg Rattray, Director of Global Cyber Partnerships and Government Strategy at JPMorgan Chase. Welcome, gentlemen. So let me start the conversation. Oh, I should say before I start that you can submit questions, and if I can figure out how to use it, we actually get to, I'll have help up here. I can actually ask your questions of the panelists, so feel free to involve yourselves in the conversation. I'd like to start, Governor Ridge, we who live here in New York have had a tough 48 hours. We've seen a physical attack. Can you compare, so as we start this discussion, kind of how you view a cyber attack versus a physical attack?
Well, first of all, I think we need to commend the community, the first responders, for the extraordinary job they did in responding to the crisis and apprehending the party responsible. That's just darn good police work. And I think everybody really needs to appreciate and understand that. And it's really rather remarkable. That's the good news. The bad news is that in perspective, and notwithstanding the pain and horror associated with a physical attack, as we've seen here in New York and in Paris and in other places around the world, the potential for physical, human, and psychic impact with a cyber attack, I think, is far more serious, given the nature of the cyber world in which we live in. I mean, there's a digital war going on in a hyper-connected world, and as earth-shaking is these isolated incidents, San Bernardino, Fort Hood, New York City, the prospects of a much more significant impact on the country's psyche, as well as physical and economic damage with a cyber attack, I think is far greater. And I think that's, hopefully we are in agreement with everybody in this panel, but we live in the digital forevermore, and that risk is dynamic. It continues to morph, continues to get more serious. Actors get better financed, and so in comparison to a physical attack, while the horror associated and the pain and suffering is considerable, greater threat and greater consequences with a cyber attack potentially.
Let me next go to General Keith Alexander. Look, we see state actors very sophisticated like Russia and China. We see non-state actors like terrorist groups who represent an asymmetric threat. They've typically used the internet to advance themselves, but they too could be disruptive. Can you talk to us, set the stage for us about what are the global threats here and at home to our cyber infrastructure, and what do we need to do, kind of the public-private partnership, and I'll turn to Dr. Brothers, to deal with that and prepare?
So first, I agree with Governor Ridge on the first responders here in New York City. Incredible job. And when we start thinking about threats to our country, cybersecurity is one of the key threats that those nations that wish us harm can reach out to. And when you look back just over the last 4 years, what hit Saudi Aramco, a set of destructive attacks that were followed by 350 distributed denial of service attacks on Wall Street by Iran. We saw attacks on South Korea, destructive attacks in March and May of 2013, causing incredible damage. We saw Sony get hit with a similar version of the same wiper virus that hit South Korea. And then we saw in a series of exploits and attacks on industry and government, and perhaps one of the most noteworthy is hitting the energy sector in the Ukraine. What's clear from all of that is that nations are using cyber as an element of national power. not only to collect information, but to hit other countries. It started in 2007 with Estonia, and it's continued and will continue to grow. And as you suggest, it creates huge problems for our country and other countries in terms of rules of engagement, in terms of everything that we want to do as a nation with our allies. And most importantly, how our government and industry have to work together. And it's in this part that I think it's extremely important. If we were to have a debate on who's responsible for protecting Sony, we could debate this all day long. But Sony could not be expected to protect themselves from a nation state hacker. And so the government has to come in. Now you have two options. The government coming in after an attack does Sony no good. They say, you've been hacked. We know we've been hacked. No, they destroyed all your data. We know they destroyed all our data. They leaked it to the press. We know they leaked it to the press. You're in a terrible situation. We know. We're toast. I'm going to get fired. Exactly. That's why we're here. The people at Sony would say, couldn't we prevent that? And how do we prevent that? And we can only prevent it when government and industry work together at network speed for indicators of an attack, such that the government can be looking at North Korea before they do the attack, not after. That requires not only what we have in cyber legislation, but for a whole change in the way we think about cybersecurity to bring this up to network speed. It involves DHS, DOD, the intelligence community, FBI, and it involves all of industry. You know, the great irony, technically, this is doable. And you can do it and protect civil liberties and privacy. And we need to do it. So I think from what I saw in government, and now what I see in industry, those are the leaps that we have to make. We have to figure out how to get the government and industry to work together, given all the rhetoric that's going on, and solve these problems.
So I can't resist, right? I used to say, now that I'm out of government, when government has a problem they don't know how to solve, what they do is they reorganize. There's now the current debate in Washington. You, when you were in government, commanded both NSA and Cyber Command. The current policy debate is, do you split them? What do you think?
Well, I think from a military perspective, my initial and where I am today is, you don't want to split these things apart. You want to really figure out, how do I have organizations work together? If an organization is too big for one person to command, well, I'd first go to Secretary Ridge and say, well, you had the biggest problem. You took all these organizations. But if you really want to solve the problem, I think what Secretary Gates was going towards is, how do we bring together the elements of DHS, FBI, DOD, and create an organization that responds to all of those secretaries to do the job. Don't split them apart, put them together. And I'm not saying it has to be a military. I'm not saying, I think you're actually talking about a civilian oversight that does both, that can transition the country from peacetime to crisis to war, where all the secretaries can work together. Secretary Gates had a great set of comments on that, and I think that still holds true today.
Secretary Just one quick comment. I think I'd be interested in my colleagues. It's still a matter of, and this is a post 9/11 world, there's still a lot of silos. And the notion that we instinctively communicate and collaborate is not something, I've seen it, I dare say, General, you saw it. The notion of aggregating that capability is spot on, but you still have to overcome an inertia that exists within some of these institutions of government to share. I think the private sector does a lot better than government does. It's just a thought. I mean, we made a lot of progress since 2001, but frankly, I still think we got a long way to go to get to the optimum situation that you've identified. And our friends at Homeland Security could probably speak to that better than I.
So let's turn to,
He's got it covered.
Thank you.
Reggie, it's all yours.
Much appreciated. So I have to agree. You started out saying how this world is a digital world now, right? And we're hyper-connected. I have to agree. And you sort of talked about, how the kind of threats that we're seeing right now and the need for this information sharing. And I think that's extremely true. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is that while right now, we have the NCIC, right? The National Cyber Security and Information Coordination Center, the NCIC, that's now the information sharing point, right? The problem is, is industry going to share? How much sharing is going to happen? There are concerns about anonymity, these kinds of things. But I think that we're setting up those kind of structures to do that kind of sharing. It's now a matter, part of the issue right now is a matter of trust, right? Is industry going to trust that we can share and keep their information secure, and we can keep their privacy intact? I think that's important. I think the other issue that I kind of want to jump on a little bit is we're talking about this public-private partnerships, right? I think the one area has to do with information sharing. Another area that is really important to us, so my organization is the Science Technology Director of DHS. And one of the big challenges that we have is in our job to bring the best kinds of technologies to the department, one of which is in cyber defense. It's how do we reach out to all the creative people in the country, right? So the way government works is, we tend to reach out to some of the people we've been reaching out before. So we'll reach out to some of the laboratories, we reach out to some of the large contractors. The significant amount of our population is doing a tremendously creative amount in the Silicon Valleys and Austins and Bostons and Chicagos, et cetera, of our country, as well as internationally. So the question is, then how do we reach out to this larger community to actually leverage the types of creativity they have and bring this type of information and technology into the government where we can use it, right? So, give me a moment. Let me just explain what we've done so far, because I'm actually pretty impressed with it. One of the challenges, like I said, we had was how do we reach out to these kind of areas? So we decided we'd set up a presence in Silicon Valley, as an example. And so what we identified a couple of problems. One problem we identified was, how do the people in Silicon Valley know what our challenges are? Because if they don't know, how will they know what to work on? Another problem is, well, this problem has to be somehow aligned to their business case, or else it's orthogonal to their investors, right? They're not going to be willing to actually work with us to solve these problems. So one of the things we did was we held a ideation event. So this is using design principles from Stanford University to talk about the Internet of Things. We're all familiar with the Internet of Things. And we said we'd do this ideation event. We brought in members of industry and government to say, what are some problems that we think the Department of Homeland Security should work on with respect to IoT? With three things I thought were interesting. The first was detect, right? How do you know what's on your network? The second thing was authentication. How do you know it is what it says it is? And the third thing was, how do you do secure updates of these technologies? So these were three things that came out of this ideation event. So what's the next problem? The next problem is, how do we actually get a solicitation out? How do we get funding out in a time constant that's appropriate for these companies, which is months, or weeks, not years? So we set up something called an Other Transaction Authority, which is a way to get money to non-traditional companies. We set up an alternate solicitation mechanism, so we based it on Shark Tank. So you can actually come in and give a video presentation or in-person presentation, get a thumbs up or thumbs down. And guess what happened? We're actually able to deliver a contract from solicitation to award in 2 months. That's pretty good for the government. That's pretty good. And we've found an awful lot of interest. So we've moved on to different topics, and we've gotten responses to our solicitation across the country. So I think in this whole idea of partnering up with industry, a huge part is information sharing with respect to threat vectors, but another part of it is getting the creativity from all of you to help us do the best job we can for the department and the nation.
Richard, let me ask you, a question came in. If you had an ask of Silicon Valley, you would probably have many asks, right, of problems they could solve. Give me 2 or 3 of your top asks of Silicon Valley. What are the problems that you most need their help solving?
I think the biggest problem we have isn't so much a particular technology. We could talk about specific technologies, but it's a bigger problem of getting their attention and getting their interest in solving these really hard, important problems. I was talking to a VC in the Valley, and he related a story. He said, why do you think there are so many dating apps? Why are there so many restaurant finding apps? He said, because you get a lot of young guys doing these apps. That's what they care about. He said, but if you present some really hard, important problems, they'll go for that too. So my ask isn't so much about a particular technology. It's really about, listen, these are some really important problems that's important to your families, to your communities. and we need your help. That's my ask.
Good. Greg, let me turn to you for a moment. You know, General Alexander talked about what happened to Sony. I think the fear of everybody in this room and everybody I know, frankly, is imagine a Sony attack, a destructive attack in the financial services sector. Can you talk to us about, you clearly worry about that every day and are working very hard against it. Can you give us a sense of how does the financial services sector wrap their head around the threat, and then the kinds of things sort of generally that you do to address that and mitigate the threat?
So I think the response is at levels, right? Certainly each firm sees it as a risk to the firm's operations, and understanding what happened, understanding how the threat is evolving, and I'll get to how we collaborate with the government in order to do that. But figuring out how we get resilient, but if it comes our way, particularly if it lands and continues, I think every firm needs to do that, right? It certainly is something that we know we may have to deal with, being for the nation on the front line as a critical infrastructure, and as General Alexander, described, that adversaries now will hit companies for national security reasons. Again, he mentioned that we had DDoS attacks. The technical vector is quite a bit different. These destructive malware attacks present real challenges. The industry is formed up around this particular challenge as firms that collaborate on what are the right procedures, how would you create a capability to basically store data in an immutable fashion so that if a firm had an event, that data could be recovered, and that the industry as a whole could recover the institution and the clients and customers could be serviced. Similar to other sorts of events that can happen in a non-cyber way, a firm can go under, yet you still want basically the finances of that to be delivered to the customers and clients. We have an information sharing and analysis center. We have a sector coordinating council. We do joint exercises with the government. There was a series of exercises in 2015 that Treasury sponsored with DHS, with all the government agencies and the firms about how do we respond to a destructive malware event. Even leaning into, what does this mean for decisions around the markets being open or closed, if it's a type of event that affects our ability to have the markets function properly. So we're going a step farther in terms of the nature of our collaboration with the government. And I think to amplify or go beyond, information sharing, my observation is the government sees these things as major threats. The resource investments necessary to really work closely with industry, understand our technology, gather the intelligence proactively about emerging risks to the next thing beyond destructive malware, and give us warning so that we can invest technologically, to have contingency plans for specific events. If the nation sanctions a company, do we expect that company would, or that country would respond with a cyber attack? Would it be on energy or transportation or financial services? We need that level of collaboration given the events that have been described. So we're working towards that. Governor Ridge, I would say, I've actually seen, having served a while in the government as well, the ability of the government to come to the table as a whole of government is improving. But the depth of the teams that come, do they know how the technology that supports financial services, that's going to require an investment beyond sort of the current level of investment in government. So
Greg, it sounds to me, but correct me, that your real ask of the government is greater fidelity in terms of warning up front, what's coming at me next. Would that be your first ask? That would be the highest leverage ask for us, so we can do the things that were described in terms of responding well to tactical warning, or even if we have a Sony-like event and a firm needs to be recovered, and there's a lot of work to do that. But it'd be much better if those systems weren't vulnerable because we saw that the adversary was developing a new technology, and we moved away from or armored up against things that were potentially coming our way. And I believe, if I was an Air Force intelligence officer, that the nation's intelligence services could do that if they provided the focus they have on other problems. Sure. Tom, did you want to weigh in here?
Well, I just thought it would be important because I think you mentioned the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. I think the audience would probably very much appreciate you going in a little greater depth in that. It is critical. I mean, financial services has the best. I know Homeland Security, and Reggie, you're working to try to take that model and apply it to the other sectors of the economy. Right. But I think, I know it works, but I think you're in the middle of it. I think the audience need to understand the economy is divided into multiple sectors. Each one has an Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And there's where that across the board information sharing within that marketplace, within those institutions, but you also have the government supporting it. And I think they need to better understand how that works, because I think it's critical to reduce the risk.
Right. So these information sharing and analysis centers called ISACs, the one in financial services has actually existed for almost 20 years. The momentum's picked up. It actually has over 7,000 members. It has in terms of organizations, not individuals. Most of the U.S. financial institutions have been encouraged actually by their regulators to join as one of the mechanisms. It's completely a private sector organization that works closely with the government. It actually has cleared personnel that sits in DHS, so that when we use the center, and it has automated tools as well, if we see something that is coming at a institution, a bank, we share it very quickly into this center, and then all the other institutions that has staff at the center that disseminates the threat. And it's a pretty vigorous sharing. Certainly it's a sector with pretty competitive institutions, but on the front of, on the cyber threat front, it's sort of widely agreed that we all suffer this risk, and we're better off if we collaborate. So for us, the ISAC is really the hub. That's where we build what I call sector-level operational capabilities. We have what's called an all-hazards playbook, which governs how we come together in a cyber crisis, like it's been described, and work with the government. So when we practice that playbook, so that if there's a problem, we can work together with the government.
One of the big questions that I think policymakers have struggled with, and certainly the private sector, especially in the wake of the DDoS attacks on the financial sectors, what are the rules of the road? So when will the government act, and when will the private sector be expected to act, and to what extent? There are liability issues associated with that. It leads to the obvious question of when is a cyber attack an act of war? People tend to agree that certainly if it results in death and physical destruction, it probably will be an act of war, although let me use the example. Probably everybody on this stage who filled out their background forms had them stolen by the Chinese government when they hacked into the OPM. If the same actors had taken a helicopter, rappelled down, broken a window, and taken it out of a desk, it would have been a physical attack and pretty obviously an act of war. But they didn't do that. It was a cyber attack. They stole very critical national information because, of course, all those individuals, many of them still retain their clearances. So, long lead into where should those rules of the road be? Where are those boundaries when government should act or the private sector should act? To the private sector, what kind of guidance do you need or do you want, do you wish you had from the government about how they're approaching the policy issue? You can take this in any particular order.
So, Fran, you're probably aware that the president issued a policy directive on the cyber response this summer. Our take is was a good step, right? It clarified a bit how the government will work and the roles within government. It also calls for the private sector to work with the government. And again, our sector is organized and it already had a response plan, so now we know how we plug in, and there's pretty active work. This would not be an area that I think, this is an area where I think progress has been made. So in the right path is sort of before us. We have to work to go down it. We're going to form a sector response plan to work with the government in response to what DHS will publish in a National Cyber Incident Response Plan. So again, my issue tends to be resources. You can have a lot of plans, but if you don't practice them and you've learned how to deal with crises effectively, and that takes harder work than actually writing the plan. So
I think we've done good on the incident response planning and the way we do incident response. And I think the teams actually come together pretty good and do some work on there. I think we need to step back and say, who is responsible for defending commercial sector and when? And so I would put on the table two sets of cases. If a bank is being attacked by people to steal money, the police would come in, the FBI would come in, and others would come in, whether it's physical, and the same thing in cyber. So there's an issue of what does a bank, any industry, what should they be responsible for? The second is if a company is being attacked by a nation state, whether it's physical assets or cyber, the government should start. Because if we say, no, Sony, you got to do this yourselves, and they counterattack and start a war on the Korean Peninsula, that's not a good thing. So these are inherently government responsibilities, but there's no capability to link the two together today. So I think we've got to step back and say, here's where we are moving towards. We want to prevent before we do incident response. We don't want plane crashes and then a lot of NTSB guys running around. We want to stop the plane crash. We want to stop cyber attacks. There's a role for the Defense Department, DHS, and the Department of Justice in doing this. And we ought to lay out those rules and how they're going to get the information and how they work as a team. Those policies, those rules, and those should be transparent for the American people. And then they should be in the playbook. Because, look, what's going to happen? You know, we have this perception that we're safe. You know, why would anybody attack us? Well, you know, in England in 1900, they said nobody would have another war because we're so intertwined economically. And if there is a war, it'd only be 2 days. And look what happened in that century. And we are at risk here too, because those countries that think, well, I could attack the United States critical infrastructure and have significant damage which would impact their ability to respond, sound like Pearl Harbor, and we're not ready for it. So we ought to take that off the table. And then finally, I'll just add one other thing. Those companies that maintain a certain level of protection, they follow the NIST guidelines and they do this, and they report, should have some better form of liability protection so they're not sued with 100 million lawsuits over the next 2 decades. Let's get this to a reasonable standard and then help the two work together. And I think what Governor Ridge said is, yeah, and we've got to practice that. Bring the team together, rehearse it. Have the playbooks on government side as good or better than what we have on industry.
I think one of the challenges for the administrations going forward in perpetuity is distinguish between those acts, and that you mentioned an attack on the private sector that the FBI might normally investigate and take action against. The trouble is some of those attackers are overseas, and the ability of them to do the investigation and hold them accountable. We can attribute these attacks, but holding the attackers, be it the nation state, the surrogate of the nation state, the organized criminal entity with support of the nation state, how do we bring those, how do we hold those folks accountable? And I think the president's executive order, although he hasn't used it but once, I think, against the North Koreans, it is to start thinking about imposing sanctions in this very complicated world. We know that the Chinese got information from our defense contractors on the Joint Strike Fighter. We know that there's a list of incursions that go on every day. Digital war's going on right now. General, you're in a better position to tell that to the world. There's a war going on. It's going on every day, every minute of every day. And they're pinging government entities. There's economic espionage that's going on. So one of the next challenges of the future administrations is when did they impose the sanctions that are economic in nature, not necessarily an act of war. But what happens, and again, I'm going to take that further, what about Article 5 of NATO? At what point in time does a cyber attack on one of our allies in Europe amount to a a collective response since we're committed to collective defense. So this whole digital forevermore, this whole framework within which you contributed so much and now you're engaged in, as we all are right now, it just gets more complex along the way, and our policymakers are going to have to really sit down and think, in the next administration and future administrations, when do they use those economic sanctions? And you say to yourself, why haven't we used them against Russia? Why haven't we used them against Iran? People underestimate what Iran's doing these days. Why haven't we used them against China? So again, these are tough issues. We're going to have to, but I think the aggregation of the capabilities we have within the government in concert with the private sector. At what point in time does J.P. Morgan respond? I don't think you should. I think that'd be government's job. What do you think?
So I would just add to this. This is an extremely important issue on international roles, rules, and
Absolutely.
Responsibilities. So we ought to set a framework up and say, here's what we're going to do, argue it here, and then go to our allies and say, what do you think, and how do we make this better? Mm-hmm. So that the things that you just brought out, Governor, in terms of, I want to extradite that guy who attacked this bank and that guy who did this, it's done, no matter which way it goes. And actually, the FBI is getting more success in that area and is making great progress. But we should have this to a point where the norms in cyberspace are such that what we're doing to protect our networks and to protect our people are standardized, whether it's a threat from terrorism or a threat from cyber. And I think they ought to put that on a ledger, put it up here on a screen and say, here's what we're going to do. Does everybody agree? And if we get the majority of the people to agree, let's go do it.
And our foes will know it as well.
Yeah,
These are the consequences for your actions. Right. We can attribute to you, here's how we're going to hold you accountable.
That's right.
So I'm going to ask my last question. It comes from the audience, but let me start by bringing Tom and I back. It's summer of 2003. You're setting up this new department, and I'm at my office in the White House, and I look up on a television screen, and no joke, the lights have gone out on the northeastern seaboard. And Tom and I are on the phone, and we don't know at the time, is this a terror attack or is it an infrastructure problem? And the only image you see is reminiscent of 9/11 with the people running across the Brooklyn Bridge. It was terrifying. Turned out to be an infrastructure problem, which leads to the audience question, and I direct it to Reggie and Tom. Reggie, what are we doing to protect critical infrastructure? Is it enough of a priority? And what should we be doing more? Why don't I start with you?
So what we're doing, so right now we have part of DHS is an organization called National Protections and Program Directorate. And this directorate has a part of it called infrastructure protection. And that's what their job is. And so there's a number of tools and techniques that we share with industry, along the ISACs that you were talking about, to try to shore up the defenses for the critical infrastructure. This gets back to this whole idea of the public-private partnerships. How are we sharing these indicators? I mentioned the NKIC, which is for the cyber infrastructure, for sharing for that. We also have an equivalent one for infrastructure as well. So we have those things going on. Then in my directorate, we have research going on for protection for financial industry, for oil and gas. We've actually started looking at research for autonomous cars, right? Because obviously these are connected vehicles, and it's important to understand what the threat modalities are as well as mitigating strategies.
I remember that well. I was secretary, you were in the White House, and I remember getting a call from the president saying, what happened? Some of you in the audience probably remember it. About 50 million people were affected. Remember I said in my opening comments, a cyber attack has potential for even greater harm. 50 million people pretty much in the darkness without electricity for almost 2 days, covering 8 states. And a tree limb fell on a line outside of Cleveland, and the cascading effects. I mean, that's the challenge that we all face. Because of the hyper-connected nature of our economy and our world, the cascading effects are something that not enough people pay attention to. I think what DHS has done is rather significant. I think that information sharing piece is very significant. I think the National Institute of Standards and Technology has set a baseline platform around which companies that heretofore haven't thought about enterprise-wide cybersecurity, at least beginning to think about it. But we've got a long way to go with regard to the critical infrastructure, clearly. And the progress is being made. I don't want to. It's not a vision of doom, but we better move more quickly than we have in the past because, frankly, the threats are more severe and more frequent.
And the good news, if there is any, and again, sort of on a hopeful note, is we do more exercises. We do them in the civilian agencies now in the government, we do them with our military partners, and we do them with the private sector, as Greg pointed out, in the financial services. We do them with our infrastructure partners. The most important thing about the exercises, and Tom and Keith and I did this, is you learn where your vulnerabilities are, the gaps in legal authorities, who's going to be in charge. I used to referee those fights when I was in the White House, and at least if you do it in an exercise, you know where the rub is between the agencies. So let me take this opportunity to wrap it up. Please, ladies and gentlemen, help me to thank our panelists.